Hi there and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Vidhi and I like talking about all things beauty. So today I have a roundup of all the different cream blushes that I have in my collection. Blushes are definitely one of my most favorite makeup products. I really find that they just liven up the face and the right shade can absolutely pull everything together in a look. The blushes that I will be discussing today are all well used and well loved. They're all blushes that are genuinely favorites of mine at some point or the other. Apart from one odd blush that I don't enjoy, the rest of them all, they definitely fall in my favorites category. And that's the reason that they've still stayed in my collection and I've not sort of, given them away or decluttered them over the years. So I just wanted to put that out there before I get into it. I will be discussing them in the order of, let's say, most beginner friendly to sort of least beginner friendly. And we'll get into the specifics as we go through each blush. I have about 8 blushes here, so I feel like that's quite a collection, and hopefully this helps you narrow down a blush in case you're looking to purchase a new one. So first up, I have the Rose Ink blush in Heliotrope. This is a cream blush that is very easy to blend because it's not super pigmented and the formula isn't very thick. It's more in between, I would say, a cream and a balm. So that makes it very easy to blend. And because it is so low on pigmentation, it's really hard to go overboard. And that's the reason why I say this is one of the most beginner friendly blushes. In terms of its finish, it has more of a glowy finish, but that glowy finish doesn't really come from the formula itself. And what I mean by that is that it's not that this is a sticky blush in any way. It has more of a pearl or a sheen running through it, which actually gives it that glowy finish. So personally, for me, that's actually better than a blush that's oily or sticky or balmy in any way, because that sort of tends to get a little bit uncomfortable wearing it through the day. But because this is more of a sheen running through the product than the actual formula, it actually wears very comfortably through the day. Having said that, it also does fade through the day, but it fades very well through the day. It doesn't get patchy or it doesn't get uneven in any way. And for me, I don't mind that. I don't mind a blush that wears well and that fades well through the day, especially for an everyday look. But this is not something that I would reach for if I'm going out for an event, or maybe if I wanted something that's going to last through the day. I have the shade Heliotrope here. Heliotrope, I would say, is a pink mauve. Personally, I think this is more well suited for fair skin tones. I don't think this will show up very well on darker skin tones. However, I know that Rose Ink also has other shades like the shade Azalea, which is a really nice berry toned shade that would work very well for darker skin tones. Next up, I have the Merit blushes. These are the Merit Flush Balms. I have two shades, the shade Fox and the shade Apres. I recently did a video about all of the different Merit products that I've tried thus far, and I will link it up in the cards for you. But basically, I would say the Flush Balms are one of my most favorite products from Merit. One reason is, of course, the shades that I own. These are shades that I gravitate towards, I would say, more than any of the other shades that I own in my collection, because they're so versatile, and again, the blushes are so easy to use. The first shade that I have is Fox. This is a nude brick shade that basically goes with absolutely every look. And then the second shade that I have is the shade Apres. Apres is more of a berry toned shade, which is one of my most favorite shades to just liven up the face a little bit. In terms of the formula, I've discussed these before. I find these, again, they're not super pigmented, similar to the Rose Ink blushes, but they're a little bit of a step up. And that again makes them very easy to blend and very easy to use. In terms of the finish, they're more of a natural to dewy finish, somewhere in the middle. Again, not sticky in any way, but definitely more moisturizing than, let's say, the Rose Ink blushes. In terms of lasting power, unfortunately, they're fairly similar to the Rose Ink blush. They don't quite last very well through the day, but again, they wear beautifully and they don't get patchy or uneven through the day. So I don't mind that. I definitely reach for these every day, especially when I'm going to work. Then I have the MAC Glow Play blushes. Now, the MAC Glow Play blushes aren't exactly cream blushes, they're more of a cream to powder formula, and they have the most unique formulation. They have this almost bouncy texture to them that makes them so very unique. Definitely the most unique texture amongst all of the blushes I have, or even really all of the makeup that I own. Unfortunately, however, I will say that these are my least used blushes amongst the lot that I have. I do really, really like these blushes as well, but it's just that the shades that I own, they're very, very muted, and that's the reason why I don't reach for them very often. In terms of the formula, as I mentioned, this is a cream to powder formula. So when they set on your face, they do set into a more natural matte finish. But some of them, some of the shades, they do have a sheen running through them. So they give a nice glow to the skin as well. I do consider these very, very easy to use because of the shades that I own. The shades that I own are very, very low on the pigmentation, and that's the reason why they blend super easily for me. However, I would imagine that if you have a darker shade from this collection, it might be a little bit, just a little bit trickier to work with, but still, for a cream to powder blush, I think they blend super, super easily. In terms of lasting power, I have to say that they do probably last better than the cream blushes that I have discussed so far. But still, I would say that there are other blushes in my collection that last a little bit better. So the two shades that I own are the shades So Natural and Blush Please. And you can see this is even after a few swatches, and so you can see how light the shades are. So Natural is basically a barely there shade, and I would imagine that these don't show up at all on a darker skin tone. Even on my skin tone, I can barely see them. So again, while I love the formula, these are not the shades that I reach for most often. Next up, I have the blushes from NUDESTIX. Now, a good way to tell how much I love a particular formula is by the number of shades that I own. So clearly, NUDESTIX is one of my most favorite blushes amongst all of the ones that I own. NUDESTIX does have two versions of their cream blushes. They have the Bloom version, which is the more dewy version, and then they have the matte sticks. And for me personally, I do prefer the matte sticks just because the finish is a little bit better. It's not quite as sticky as the Bloom collection. I still think that if you shear out the Bloom collection sufficiently and you just set it in with powder, it's not an issue at all. But the formula is stickier than the matte blushes. So it's more of a relative thing. I don't personally find them to be uncomfortably sticky, but if I were to compare the two, yes, the Bloom formula is a little bit stickier. In terms of pigment, these are definitely a step up from the blushes that I have discussed thus far. But the beauty of these blushes is in the fact that despite the pigment, they still blend very, very easily on the skin. And an added bonus is that they also last very well through the day. Not like 8 hours lasting power, but at least a good 4 to 5 hours, which is more than a lot of the blushes that I have discussed so far. As I mentioned, my personal preference is the matte collection, but I will say that the Bloom collection does have some absolutely gorgeous shades, and one of my most favorite, actually my most favorite shade amongst the NUDESTIX blushes is from the Bloom collection, and that's the shade Bohemian Rose. And I'll swatch all of these in a minute, but I just wanted to show you this, that occasionally the Bloom collection, the stick might melt in the heat, and this has happened for my blush. I have not noticed this with the matte collection, so I have to believe that this is specific to the Bloom collection. Doesn't make the blush unusable in any way. I can still continue to use it with a brush, but just something to know in case you wanted to buy these. So I have 5 shades here from the NUDESTIX collection. I'm gonna start here. So first up, I have the shade Bohemian Rose. This is the only one in the Nudies Bloom collection. Then I have the shade Naughty and Spice. So while this Bohemian Rose is more of a true pink, Naughty and Spice is more of a nude pink, and I feel like this is definitely my most used shades amongst all the five that I own. The third shade here is Picante. This is NUDESTIX collaboration with Alana Davison. And honestly, it's a lovely shade. It looks absolutely stunning on the stick and even in swatches. But on me, such a bright orange, it just doesn't look nice. It almost makes me look a little bit sick. So I think I'm going to be passing that on to a friend. But if you have fair skin, for example, I think that would be an absolutely lovely blush for the summer. Then I have the shade Sweet Peach Peony, which is a light peach shade. And honestly, on my skin tone, it barely shows up, but I got it as part of a set, so I do use it occasionally. And then finally, this is a bronzer shade in Sunkissed. So while this is a bronzer shade, because it has a fair bit of red running through it, I can make use of it as a blush, and it is a shade that I have been reaching for lately, almost like a blush and bronzer combination. Next up, I have my absolute favorite blushes in my collection, and these, if you have watched my channel for any amount of time, will be no surprise to you. These are the Glossier Cloud Paints. I would rank these to be my absolute top favorite amongst my collection, and probably the NUDESTIX blushes would rank second. But coming to the Glossier Cloud Paints, the packaging for these blushes is truly like watercolor paints, right? They come in this like squeeze tube, and they're quite highly pigmented, and their texture is also very, very close to actual paints. What I really like about these blushes is, despite being super pigmented, they're also super, super blendable and very easy to use. Another thing that I really love about these blushes is that their finish will mimic the finish of your foundation or your base. If you have a glowy base on, these will end up looking glowy. But if you have a matte base on, these will end up looking matte. And that's the reason why I enjoy them so much. They're such a versatile blush to have. I also enjoy using one of the shades as an eyeshadow, just all over my lid, and it works perfectly well. So, because they're literally like paints, you could use them however you enjoy. If a particular shade appeals to you as a bronzer, you could very, very easily do that. I guess you could pretty much as easily do that for any of these, but it's the finish of these that actually differentiates these from the rest of the blushes that I own. In terms of lasting power, these will absolutely last through the day. These are my most fail-safe blushes in my collection, and if I'm looking for a blush that's going to last through the night if I'm going out for an event, these are 100% the ones that I will be reaching for. I just set them in with a powder blush, and that's it. They do not budge. So I have 4 shades in the Glossier Cloud Paints. I'm going to be starting from here. So this is the shade in Haze. This is definitely my most used shade. Then I have the shade Puff. Then I have the shade Beam, and then I have the shade in Dusk. Dusk is the shade that I like to use as an eyeshadow. And another thing that I wanted to point out here is that if you notice these shades, a lot of them, or the 3 shades here that I have, they're actually true pastel shades, right? And that's not something that you see very often in blushes. So that is fairly unique to Glossier, and I must give that to them. In terms of the shades specifically, I will say that amongst all of them, Haze, being sort of the darkest and most pigmented, can be a tad tricky to work with. And when I say a tad tricky, I just mean a little bit trickier than the other ones that I have discussed so far. And that's just because it is a darker shade. Still, I still think the formula is absolutely wonderful, and you can very, very easily make this work. I like to use them with a brush and just dip my brush into them and then go in on my face, and that works perfectly well. I've almost never had an instance where they end up looking uneven on my skin at all. The next blushes that I have are from a brand called PHYTOSURGENCE. Now, PHYTOSURGENCE is a smaller brand. They are based out of Vancouver. They have a very small but curated collection of blushes, bronzers, and eyeshadows. And so far, the blushes that I've tried from them are absolutely amazing. They're definitely, I would say, the most underrated blushes that I have in my collection. These are again cream blushes with a finish, I would say, very, very similar to the Glossier Cloud Paints, in the sense that they're not necessarily matte or glowy. They will take up the finish of the base that you have on, and that's something that I absolutely love in them. In terms of blendability, I would say it's very, very dependent on what shade you look at. I have two shades here. I have the shade Sublimate and I have the shade Ember. I find the shade Sublimate, which is a darker shade, to be a little bit trickier to work with just because it is a darker shade and it is fairly pigmented. But for example, the shade Simmer is very, very easy to work with because it is a lighter shade. So it is a little bit dependent on what shade you get, but having said that, I still think that they're fairly easy to blend. Of course, a little bit trickier than the ones that I have discussed so far, but still fairly easy because they don't set in right away. They do have a fair bit of playtime. So here are the swatches of the two shades that I own. This is the shade Sublimate. So this is a much darker, earthier berry toned, and this is the shade Ember, which is a more peachy orange tone. Now this orange actually looks really nice on my skin, but I don't quite know the difference between this orange and the Picante orange, so I couldn't tell you what it is that differs between the two, but I know that Ember definitely works better for me. In terms of lasting power, I would say they do last quite well through the day. Not quite as long as the Glossier Cloud Paints, but they come fairly close in my opinion. Especially if you set them in with a powder blush or with just a powder in general, I do think they can last quite well. And if they do end up fading, I find that they fade quite well, so that's not an issue at all. Next up, I have the Tower 28 blush in the shade After Hours. Now, Tower 28 blushes, they are much more pigmented than all the blushes that I have discussed so far. And in addition to being pigmented, what makes them a little less beginner friendly is the fact that this formula is actually fairly stiff and more balmy than it is creamy. So if I were to just dip my finger a little bit, I pick up a ton of pigment. And that makes it a little bit tricky to blend out. I still think you can work with them. I still think you can blend them out very, very easily, especially if you use them with a brush. It's harder to go overboard, but I have to say that they're a little bit trickier than the other blushes. Having said that, I absolutely love this shade and I absolutely love how this looks on my cheeks. They have more of a natural to natural matte finish despite being so balmy in the packaging. Because the pigment is so high, you do end up shearing it out quite a bit, and because of that they actually lose that balminess and they almost set into like a natural to a natural matte finish. And so I really, really enjoy that. And this is the shade that I have. As I mentioned, this is the shade in After Hours. This is definitely one of my most favorite shades that I own. And another thing that I really like about this formula is as easily as it works on the cheeks, the same way it works on the lips. I personally have not used any of the other cream blushes on my lips, but this one I have used on my lips and I find that it actually looks really, really nice when I just dab a little bit onto the lips. So it is fairly versatile and it is fairly easy to use if you're just a little bit more careful. In terms of lasting power, I would say these are very, very similar to the PHYTOSURGENCE blushes. They would last through the day especially well if you have set them in. But if not, they will still last, I would say, up to the 6 or 7 hour mark, after which I find that they do start to fade a little bit. But having said that, they fade very well, so I don't mind that at all. This brings me to the final blushes in my collection, and I have to say, this particular blush formula is my least favorite blush formula amongst all of the ones that I've tried so far, and it's also the least beginner friendly formula. So these are the new elf camo blushes. Now, as amazing as I had hoped for this formula to be, I find that it has disappointed me that much. Unfortunately, these blushes are just way too pigmented for everyday use or just for use in general. Usually I end up taking like a dot of the product. This is the amount that I end up taking, and even from this, I would say 50 to 60% just ends up going waste. I by no means can get these to work with a brush. That is almost impossible given how pigmented they are. The number of times that I've had a chance to use them, I have almost always ended up going overboard because they are so intensely pigmented. And it's not just the fact that they are so pigmented. As I mentioned, the Tower 28 blushes are also quite pigmented. The problem with these, however, is that in addition to being pigmented, once they go onto your skin, the playtime that you get is very, very low. They will set onto your skin basically in a matter of 10 to 15 seconds. And that's really not a lot of playtime at all. So you have to be very, very quick and you have to be very, very careful in working with them. The only way that I've sort of got them to work is using a beauty blender and just sort of dabbing it onto my cheeks. But even then, I can almost see the patchiness that goes on because, again, the formula is such that it starts to set. So you can almost see the spots unless you're careful and you really, really blend it out. So, really, not my most favorite formula. I would not recommend these for beginners at all. Another thing I will add is that in terms of lasting power, yes, they do last through the day, and in terms of finish, yes, they do have more of a natural finish, so they'll take up the finish that your base has. But despite those benefits, I don't think the pros outweigh the cons. I'll just quickly swatch the shades that I have. So the first shade that I have here is the shade Pinky Promise, which is a true pink. And then the second shade that I have here is the shade Bronze Bombshell. Um, Honestly, the shade range from these e.l.f. camo blushes is absolutely fantastic. I was really hopeful that if I enjoy this formula, I would actually go in and pick out one or two more shades because they have such nice and fresh shades that could work with a variety of different looks, and they are quite affordable. But unfortunately, the formula is just so tricky to work with that I would be very wary of recommending these to anyone, or even for that matter, getting a couple more shades for myself. So that rounds up all of the blushes that I wanted to review for you guys today. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope this was informative enough for you to be able to make a decision if you were looking for a new blush. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having an absolutely fantastic day. I will see you next time. Bye bye.